This is Speak Up. I am Sandra Schulte. Welcome back to our show. Today I'm thrilled to have Gene Epstein back with us. He was the editor, the financial and book editor of Barron's Financial Weekly. Then he went on to become the director of a very, very interesting forum called Soho Forum. They talk about political theory. They talk about economic theory. Two people have to take two sides of the argument, and they bat it out verbally on the stage. And then people vote afterwards about it. Anyway, his last published book was EcoSpinning, How to Read Between the Lines When the Media Manipulate the Numbers. He taught economics at the City University of New York and St. John's University. He worked as a senior economist for the New York Stock Exchange. So I think we have someone who's very well-versed here.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you for that generous introduction. It's interesting that the title of that book probably then was a mistake because it's easy to stumble on that N-O. Best pronounced as EcoSpinning, and not so sort of trippingly on the tongue, but I guess it's difficult to master. I published that book a while back. It is still in print, but it was published in 2006. So it's basically now sort of a work of history. The first few chapters, I did go after Paul Krugman. It's the Nobel. He since won a Nobel Prize. I guess I helped put him on the map. It was almost impossible to write a book about how to read between the lines when the media manipulate the numbers without giving a fair amount of space to Paul Krugman. And I promoted the book, but in fact, in many of the media outlets were sort of offended that I had the temerity to say that Paul Krugman manipulated the numbers and was dishonest in the way he covered the numbers. You mentioned the Soho Forum, and I guess in a way it sounds like it's a little bit of a staid organization, although you did talk about people duking it out. It is, strictly speaking, a debate society. That's all we do is one-on-one debates. But also, just to correct one other point you made, which is that you vote before the resolution you vote on the resolution before the debate begins, and then you vote afterwards. You vote yes, no, or undecided on the resolution. 3 different votes, yes, no, or undecided, on the debate resolution. For example, I took the negative on a debate resolution that read, selfishness is a virtue. That was the resolution. Selfishness is a virtue, and as you might imagine, the person who defended that resolution was a devotee of Ayn Rand. And so I said, no, selfishness is not a virtue. And that was the resolution. And that was a simple one. It's always a statement, a declaration. I actually also had 3 debates with a resolution that in 2 out of 3 cases read the same way. Socialism is preferable to capitalism. As a way of promoting equality, prosperity, and what was the other one? Equality and prosperity. I guess those are the only 2 things: equality and prosperity. I did 3 debates of that sort because there were so many socialists out there happy to debate me. And in one of those debates, which I had against Professor Richard Wolff, who is regarded as the premier socialist in the country, has had more than 3 million YouTube downloads. So I'm gratified about that because I think that it did expose Professor Wolff's views to a certain amount of intellectual ridicule. Technically, I did win according to Oxford-style rules. So that's just to give people a flavor of the kind of topics we do. I'm not the only debater at the Soho Forum. I've done 6 debates at the Soho Forum. We've had 60 debates, so 54 of those debates were done by others. And the debate we have coming up on February 17th is going to be between Jonathan Haidt, who is fairly well known, NYU professor, on the role of social media and the dangers of social media. And he will debate Robbie Suave of the Reason Foundation, who will be defending the idea of social media. And Jonathan Haidt is concerned about social media and thinks that government should rein in some of its abuses. That's going to be our February 17th debate. So again, that's
tune in.
what our Soho Forum. Yeah. Well, tune in and come. Buy a ticket. Go to thesohoforum.org. You can buy a ticket to that debate.
Now, people are quitting their jobs in record numbers.
Yeah.
Vaccination job requirements or weekly COVID testing is occurring. There's 1.5 jobs for every jobless person.
Yeah.
Where is the economy going?
Well, that actually triggers my what I said last time we spoke, which is that I think the seeds are being set for a price inflation because the labor markets are so tight. That 1.5 number you decided is, again, to put a fine point on it, is that the Bureau of Labor Statistics keeps track. It's been doing this since 2000. Bureau of Labor Statistics is a government agency. They're in charge of a lot of numbers, the unemployment rate, employment generally. They've been at it for many decades, and they do serve a purpose. They do deliver numbers that are often useful. And in this case, they track month by month the number of job openings in the economy. Job openings. This is something they only began doing in late 2000, so we don't have a lot of history on it. But it does go back 20 years, nearly 21 years by now, of job openings. And the number of job openings were in excess of 10 million in November. That was their latest report. And then what I did, and what other analysts do as well, is then compare the number of job openings with the number of people who were officially listed as unemployed. And an unemployed person is technically somebody who is without a job and wants a job. And in order to show that you want a job, you have to say yes to a survey that asks you, did you look for a job over the last 4 weeks? So that's the jobless, and that's job.
What bothers me about that question is that it doesn't break it down further.
No.
Like, for instance, what's the type of job? Does the person have the skills for the How do the people who are jobless, who want a job, do they have the skills for the jobs?
Yeah.
Things like that.
Well, I basically agree with you. I would say that almost definitely the number of people who are counted as unemployed, it's usually an exaggeration. Only in particular because related to what you said, but not quite what you said, which is that if you were interviewed by a government, actually it's a census worker. The survey for the monthly unemployment rate is run by the Census Bureau, and census interviewers then ask you, either in person or over the phone, do you have a job? No. Did you look for work do you want a job? Yes. Did you look for work over the last 4 weeks? Yes, I did. And then they do ask you, what did you do to look for a job? And most answers that you give are acceptable. Like one answer that you give is, I called up a relative and I asked him, do you know of anything out there? And that's acceptable as an answer. And it has been exposed even by analysts at the Bureau of Labor Statistics that when people are asked by the government, do you want a job, even though they don't really want a job, they say they do. And then secondly, as I once joked, if you have a deadbeat cousin and you're supporting him and he's without a job and you ask him, how did you look for work over the last 4 weeks? Well, I called up Cousin Morty about a job. And you'd say, well, that's ridiculous. You obviously don't want a job. How have you been looking for a job? So therefore, it's definitely true that many people who are without work are really not that interested in getting a job. They might be getting unemployment insurance. And indeed, over the past few years, 2 years, I should say, a lot of people who are unemployed have been getting checks from the government. And this has meant that they're not really interested in working. And so that number, to go back to that number that I mentioned, about 7 million unemployed officially and more than 10 million job openings, that's 1.5 openings for every unemployed person. Well, probably it's even more than 1.5 because I don't really believe that there are 7 million unemployed people who are really interested in working because of what I just said, which is that the standards are so lenient to find out if you really want a job that I don't really think a lot of those people really do want a job.
I think a lot of them are living at home with people who are supporting them.
Yeah, but when the government asks you, well, do you want a job? You say yes, and then you can give a simple answer. Well, yeah, I answered a single ad. You could answers that wouldn't really persuade you and me if it was our relative are convincing to the government. So therefore, to get back to the point about 1.5 jobs for every unemployed person. And now if you look at that same number over the last 20 years, I ran a chart on my Twitter feed. That my Twitter feed, by the way, is at Gene Soho Forum. You'll get a lot of economic information if you subscribe to my Twitter at Gene Soho Forum. I ran a chart, and that 1.5 is off the charts. Over the last 20 years, usually the number of jobs available of openings is fewer than the number of officially counted as unemployed. Now it's 1.5. So therefore, jobs are going begging. There's a hiring panic. I think it's an argument for more immigration, by the way, but you were going to ask a question about it.
But I also do think it's an argument for sending jobs overseas, more jobs overseas.
Well, what will be the reaction? Yeah, no, indeed. Obviously, employers have got to react, and they'll react in different ways. One of them will be, indeed, more interest in expanding overseas operation if they can get it, and if they have the potential to do that. That's absolutely right. Another interest will be to put in more robotics. What were you going to say?
Or if they can, import workers from abroad.
Yeah, employ workers from abroad. I think there'll be some pressure for immigration as well. There are lots of poor people who in the world who want American jobs, who will work at less than minimum wage. Less than minimum wage for them is a fabulous income compared with what they've got in their home country. And then, indeed, more mechanization. But then, as well, as I mentioned in the last interview you and I did, that's a very, very tight labor market, which does mean that wages are going to rise, that there's a lot of pressure to hire people. Wages are going to rise, and I believe that because of other factors I mentioned last time, that heat up of wage inflation is going to cause a heat up of price inflation, and that's going to accelerate the tendency for the Federal Reserve to print more money. Now, look, I should say that, of course, I'm a bleeding heart capitalist. I want wages to rise. I want productivity to rise. I just don't see that the way it's been happening, that's the best way for it to happen. Because, by the way, the businesses that are getting shafted are less the large corporations than the small businesses, the bodegas, the places that actually serve the needs of poor people. Are getting hurt by the labor shortage. And so, again, I think that there's a tendency on a part of the progressive left to think that you and I are sounding heartless when we speak in these terms. But the fact of the matter is that the situation usually hurts poor people more than it hurts rich people. What the labor shortages and the supply chains and all the rest of it and the price inflation that's resulting is very hard on the pocketbook of people of limited means. And so that's another and crucial reason why it's a bad thing to regret. Yeah.
Any solutions?
Well, solutions. Well, I have very many radical solutions to the economy. I just don't think that they're going to get implemented. I do think that the situation will ease. We have had. It's not going to. It will ease, even though it's going to spark price inflation. The labor shortage is going to ease. There'll be more people seeking jobs.
Will the fact that people are going to run out of the money that the government gave them to stay home.
Yeah, it's going to run out. It's running out already. Yeah, and more people are showing up for work, and that's good. And so I do think that that we if you look at the labor shortages in hospitality, look at labor shortages across the board, I think they're going to ease over the next year. So that's that's a positive. It's because of what you said, that the holdouts, people who are not interested in working, that they're coming back into the labor force. Tomorrow we have another employment number coming out from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and I believe that it'll show that we've had a tangible increase in the number of people employed. So it isn't that awful a situation, such that it isn't susceptible to some improvement over the next year or so. Yeah.
Let's see. Some people posit that the Biden and the Trump foreign policies are similar. I was wondering how this affects the economic structural change now and going forward.
Well, I don't. I mean, I think that you could say that there is a similarity between the Trump and the Biden administration. I personally believe, I mean, this is a political statement, and you may not agree. I do believe we have a bloated military, and that puts pressure on the budget. I don't think there's going to be a hot war between the U.S. and China, or a hot war between the U.S. and the former Soviet Union, otherwise known as Russia, which is actually quite a weak and inconsequential country. But certainly there'll be saber rattling. The reason why I don't believe that war can break out between these countries is not because I'm any expert in economics. You may have your own opinion that's just as good as mine. But I'm persuaded that the reason why there has not been a World War III since the last World War II is precisely because of the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Because I believe that there's a real hesitancy on the part of countries that have nuclear weapons to go into a war. And there has not been a war between nuclear-armed countries. The Russians have nuclear weapons, the Chinese have nuclear weapons, and the U.S. does as well. It's been a reason why, by the way, countries want nuclear weapons, because they feel they have impact on the world, impact on whether there will be a war between them and the U.S. If they have the nuclear weapons. But if we talk about the tensions between China and the U.S., tensions between Russia and the U.S., I think that there will be saber rattling, but I don't think that we have anything to worry about in terms of an actual war, in terms of actually something like what some people fear.
Do you think the return on capital going forward is going to continue to exceed U.S. economic growth?
The return on capital. That gets into something else I've tweeted about when you talk about the return on capital. In the early stages of price inflation, there is a tendency, although it isn't, I don't even know if it happened in the 1970s, I'd have to look it up, a tendency for prices to take off that a company can charge faster than its costs take off. So that produces that the prices you can charge are taking off faster than your costs, then that does mean that your profits rise. Your rate of profit rises. But if you look at any conventional measure of profit margins, which is data that's abundantly available from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, something I've done, and I've run charts on that as well in my Twitter account, then you find that actually years in which price inflation was close to double digits, or at least the high single digits, high inflation years have generally been bad for profits, and low inflation years have been better for profits. So it's exactly the reverse of what some progressives seem to think, that companies in general, corporations in particular, benefit from price inflation. Now, the reason for that is fairly simple. It's because price inflation also affects costs, because after a short while, your costs catch up with the prices that you might charge. And so in most years of a price inflation, you're caught in a potential squeeze. Your prices are rising, the prices you can charge are rising, but your costs may be rising even faster. And empirically, factually, we find, as I say, that in the 1970s, when price inflation was heating up, profit margins were lower than in the 1950s and early 1960s, when price inflation was relatively tame, and profits were pretty healthy in the aughts, in the 2010, 2012, when price inflation was slow. Similarly, it was healthier in the aughts. I mean, I'm using the expression the aughts, and that's a difficult word to use.
You mean?
2005, 2010, 2015, the early part of the 21st century. You compare profit margins with the 1970s, and again you find the profit margins were higher recently when price inflation was slow than the 1970s when price inflation was heating up. So that if indeed price inflation continues to heat up, which is what I anticipate to happen, it will not be good news for profits, as it has not been good news in the past. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
That's some crystal ball.
Yeah. Well, I'm basing that on the patterns of the
Yes.
past, which are pretty pronounced. Yeah.
And that's
yeah.
all you can base.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Thanks
yeah.
on,
Well,
really.
yeah, the patterns of the past are always important. You have to try to think in terms of, well, what's different now? Past is not destiny. The future could change, but I think pretty much those rules will apply because again we forget that when you talk about prices heating up, and I emphasize the most important price of all is the wage that people earn. The salaries that people earn, that's the major price that's across the board. And those prices can heat up and put a company in a squeeze. And of course, obviously, the price of oil, the price of other inputs, those prices heat up and put a company in a squeeze. And so for that reason, I don't think that the price inflation is good news for profits. Yeah.
So even though these programs that put a lot more cash into the economy are being withdrawn, we're still going to be having inflation, I guess.
Well, yeah, no, indeed, because I think that again, this I guess you could regard as debatable, but that what sparks an inflation, what sparked the inflation in the 1970s, let's put a fine point on it that way, was we had a very low unemployment rate in the late 60s and early 1970s. 73, we had less than a 4% unemployment, 3.5%. So that was a tight labor market that had the additional ingredient of monetary expansion, which induced prices to rise. But what did happen over subsequent years is that the labor markets got looser. So people say, well, what do you mean tight labor market? Weren't the labor markets loose in the mid to late 70s? Indeed, higher unemployment rates. Didn't we have stagflation? Stagflation meaning that you had high unemployment, slower growth, and high prices. The worst of all worlds. Well, yes, but I think that what really happened was that once you have the beginnings of a tight labor market that sparks an inflation, then the dynamic feeds on itself, because then the prices respond, then wages will respond even when the unemployment rate is high, and the government responds by expanding the money supply. And so for that reason, we did observe the phenomenon of a price inflation being sparked in the early 70s by, in part, a tight labor market, but then even as labor markets got looser in the later part of the 70s, the price inflation fed on itself. So that's what I anticipate is very likely to happen going forward right now. So even though I would say that the labor market, the very tight labor market right now is going to loosen, I'm afraid it will cause the dynamic that I mentioned, that the Federal Reserve is going to continue to expand the money supply. Well, that because of factors that I mentioned last time, it doesn't want to hike the interest rate. It will want to accommodate the need on the part of the federal government to monetize more of the federal government's debt, and prices will rise, and the dynamic will continue. So therefore, I don't think that the looser labor market is going to lessen the impulse, the pressures toward price inflation going forward. I hope I'm wrong, but certainly the lesson of the 1970s tells us that I probably will be right.
We seem to have a lot of money floating around looking for a place to be placed.
Yeah.
Do you see its long-term? Its place? How do you see its placement, long-term and short-term, in terms of capital expenditures by corporations?
Well, I think I think that there will be continued real investment in across the board. I should mention that one of the things that's changed about investment, capital investment, over the last 50 years, is that so much more of it is actually in software. That's part of investment. So much more of it is in other forms of intellectual property and intangibles, and rather than in what we think of as capital investment in physical plant and equipment. But I don't belittle that. I think that software is eating the world. There probably will be some good things to continue to come out from what software can do for us and its benefits to the world. So therefore, I don't think that. I think that if anything, there will be more capital investment induced by what you and I were speaking about earlier, which is that a response to the scarcity of labor is for business to look for more ways to substitute capital for labor, to invest in more robotics, which is not a good thing because it takes away, first of all, it uses up scarce resources for capital investment, but in addition to that, it takes away potential jobs for people of limited skills. If McDonald's starts resorting to robots to do a lot of the things that young people could do on the job, then they're denied the opportunity to learn on the job and to gain experience on the job. But with respect to the capital investment, a lot of it then will be oriented toward more substitution of capital for labor. Now that the minimum wage is rising, and now that wages are rising, that will be a response for businesses to cut down on employment, which is not necessarily a good thing for people you and I care about, which is people of limited skills who need the work experience in order to better themselves.
What's the main ideas that you think our public should take away with them?
Go into a sales job, for example, because if you're good at selling and marketing, then usually that has to be done by people who know the local culture. Your job is unlikely to be taken away from you by somebody in Calcutta. But even so, though, if you have skills as a coder, and there's still plenty of jobs in that field, even though coding can be done by somebody in Beijing or Calcutta, even though you'll have plenty of competition. Software is still eating the world. There's still a future there. So in terms of my crystal ball I suddenly turned your question into where will the jobs be? What jobs should young people apply for? One of the crucial rules is, again, look for jobs that require an understanding of the local culture, that require the ability to interact with people, because otherwise you may face competition from somebody 10,000 miles away on the other side of the world. But in addition, if you have skills that relate to information technology, then I do believe that's not going away. It's still primary. There's still all kinds of ways in which software is eating the world. Software is doing things for us that I think are basically good, basically wonderful. And if you have skills in that regard, you're also going to do well.
Gene, I want to thank you so much for coming to this show.
Sure.
This is Speak Up. I am Sandra Schulte. Thank you so much and have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day. Goodbye.